In Pripyat, the Ferris wheel was meant to start turning for the first time on May Day. It never carried a single laughing child. It stood ready, new seats, fresh paint scheduled to open just 5 days after the disaster, and then history nailed it in place. As a local historian, I've learned that catastrophes don't always begin with a roar in people's minds. Often they begin with routine and order, a key turned in a lock, a uniform pulled on in the dark. On April 26, 1986, at 1:23, Reactor 4 exploded. 6 minutes later, at 1:29, the Pripyat Fire Brigade was dispatched to the plant only about 4 kilometers from the city. Among the first responders was 25-year-old firefighter Vasyl Ignatenko. The call didn't come with the word radiation. It came with the word fire. That difference is everything. Roof fires had to be stopped fast, because combustible materials such as bitumen were used in parts of the plant's roofing, and flames on adjacent structures threatened Unit 3, which was still operating. In other words, the firefighters weren't just saving a building, they were trying to keep a second reactor from becoming the next headline. At the site, the night looked unreal. The reactor building torn open, debris scattered where no debris should ever be. Superheated fragments, including pieces of graphite and other reactor materials, had been hurled onto rooftops and walkways, igniting multiple small blazes. Ignatenko and his comrades climbed to the roofs near the ventilation block and Unit 3, hauling hoses up stairwells and ladders, stamping out small fires that were anything but small in meaning. Here is one of the most chilling truths rarely understood outside technical reports. Even the instruments were lying to them. Radiation in the worst-hit areas has been estimated at about 5.6 roentgens per second, over 20,000 roentgens per hour, enough to deliver lethal doses in minutes. Yet most of the dosimeters available on the night had very low upper limits and simply went off scale. Crews could only tell that levels were somewhere above 0.001 roentgens per second, about 3.6 roentgens per hour, while the real numbers in some spots were vastly higher. That technical ceiling became a human trap. If your meter cannot show you the cliff edge, you keep walking. By dawn, Pripyat still looked like a normal Saturday. People went to markets. Radios played music. The amusement park waited for May Day. The wider country, too, was kept in the dark. The Soviet Union's first public admission was a short statement on April 28 after radiation was detected abroad and denial became impossible. Even the silence had its own protocol. Observers noted that around the time of the first announcement, regular broadcasts were replaced with classical music, a familiar Soviet cue that something terrible had happened, even when officials refused to say what. And then came the most bitter theater, May Day. In Kyiv and other cities, parades were not fully canceled, because leaders said they lacked the full picture and feared panic. Later, even Gorbachev acknowledged that the celebrations went ahead while authorities were still trying to understand the scale. The evacuation of Pripyat carried the soft voice of deception. The city was emptied on April 27, about 36 hours after the explosion. Residents were told it would be temporary, roughly 3 days, so they took documents and essentials and left behind the rest of their lives: photos, toys, pets, winter coats that would never again be worn in those apartments. In the months that followed, the word liquidator would cover hundreds of thousands of people: soldiers, engineers, miners, medical staff pulled into a cleanup measured not only in rubble but in human bodies. But on the first night, liquidation looked like a handful of firefighters on a roof, doing what they had always done: stopping fire from spreading. Years later, when archives began to open, the story grew darker in a different way. Declassified Soviet-era materials described earlier problems and incidents at the plant and the habit of suppressing bad news to prevent panic. Chernobyl was not only an accident, it was also a system trained to hide its own alarms. Soon, Ignatenko would be evacuated to Moscow's Hospital No. 6, the specialized radiological clinic where doctors attempted bone marrow transplants and other emergency treatments for the worst exposed. His pregnant wife, Lyudmila, would follow him there, and the intimate, heartbreaking truths of Chernobyl would move from the reactor site to a hospital bedside. When the first Chernobyl firefighters were flown to Moscow, they didn't arrive as heroes in a parade. They arrived like evidence sealed off, watched, whispered about. For decades, Hospital No. 6 was spoken of the way people speak of a locked room. Everyone knew it existed. Few knew what happened inside. Western reporters caught glimpses and fragments. Soviet citizens got silence. Hospital No. 6 was one of the main places where the worst acute radiation cases were treated, and the numbers alone show the scale that officials struggled to admit. Contemporary reporting described hundreds hospitalized after exposure, mostly firefighters and plant workers, with estimated doses reaching the hundreds of rads in the most severe groups. A first-hand medical account written later also describes patients ranging from roughly 100 to over 1,000 rads, advanced antibiotics and blood products, and even a life island, a plastic enclosed environment meant to protect a patient from infection when the immune system had been wiped out. And infection was the quiet killer. Popular memory often reduces radiation sickness to a single image: burns, vomiting, collapse, but in the hospital it became a long siege: marrow failure, immune collapse, the body turning into a battlefield where ordinary microbes suddenly had the upper hand. The doctors were racing time with transfusions, sterile rooms, experimental transplants. This is where Vasyl Ignatenko's story becomes more than tragedy, it becomes testimony. His wife, Lyudmila, came to Moscow pregnant, carrying the kind of hope that feels almost indecent in a disaster. Her account, recorded later in Svetlana Alexievich's oral history, describes how she refused to leave him, even when staff warned her, even when rules said no. In one published excerpt, she remembers a nurse telling her bluntly that a dose around 400 roentgens is lethal, while claiming her husband had received far more. Whether every number in that memory is clinically precise matters less than what it reveals. Nobody trusted the truth anymore. Not the wives, not the nurses, not even the authorities. One of the most enduring hidden truths of Chernobyl isn't that officials hid the danger, everyone knows that now. It's how the vacuum of information manufactured myths that felt like truth. In the early days, people sincerely believed the victims themselves were radioactive objects, walking reactors dangerous to touch. That fear shaped hospital rules, family choices, and a generation of guilt. Years later, physicians involved in the response pushed back hard against that idea. Dr. Robert Peter Gale, who helped treat radiation patients, wrote that the HBO-style depiction of victims as radioactive hazards is wrong in the key way that matters here. The victims were not radioactive in the sense people imagined, and the fetal risk from such contact would be extremely small. So what happened to Lyudmila's baby? Lyudmila believed with a grief that reads like a verdict that her child took the whole shock, like a lightning rod. That belief appears in later retellings of her story. But medical voices argue that this interpretation is not how radiation exposure works in this case, and that the danger to others after decontamination was widely misunderstood in 1986. Both things can be true at once. A mother can lose a child after that hospital month and feel the cause in her bones, and doctors can insist that the human radiation sponge idea is not a scientific mechanism. Chernobyl left people living in the gap between those truths. Ignatenko's own decline is documented. He died in Moscow on May 13, 1986, from acute radiation syndrome complications. His funeral followed 2 days later. Accounts note that he was buried at Midinsko Cemetery and that the burial involved special measures. An inner zinc coffin is repeatedly mentioned in summaries of his life, and the cemetery became a resting place for multiple early victims of acute radiation syndrome. Here's another detail that stayed half hidden for years, because it doesn't fit heroic posters. Even in death, the state treated these men as containment problems. Descriptions from later sources speak of graves effectively turned into mini sarcophagi, zinc-lined coffins, and concrete used as shielding. Lyudmila's child, Natasha, is often listed as living only briefly and being buried with her father. That pairing, father and newborn together, became one of the most haunting private symbols of the disaster. Not just a reactor that exploded, but a future that was never allowed to begin. And then there's the third, quieter truth that locals repeat when they stop performing for tourists. Chernobyl didn't only poison bodies, it trained people to doubt their own senses. Doctors like Alla Shapiro, a first responder physician, have described how responders were not prepared and not given any information. How they were sent into uncertainty without protective gear or clear instructions. That is the real engine of the catastrophe's long tail, not only radiation, but the administrative reflex to minimize, delay, and control the narrative. So when you stand today in the silence of Pripyat or read the names at Midinsko, remember what Vasyl Ignatenko's story actually teaches. He didn't die because he misunderstood nuclear physics. He died because his job was to run toward fire, and the system around him treated truth like a resource to be rationed. In the end, the little-known fact is not a hidden document or a secret dose number. It's something more human and more terrible. For the first responders and their families, Chernobyl was a disaster where even love had to pass through checkpoints, yet still, love kept going in.